A couple of weeks ago, I was up here preaching and I introduced some thoughts about understanding our worship. I want to continue going down that path today because I think there are still some things left on the table that we can really discuss and talk about as far as how we are coming before God, how we are approaching God, how we are viewing God, and all of those kinds of things. But if you can remember, we talked about how there are different elements, right, to this whole idea of what worship is, and we've talked about how worship isn't meant to just be confined to the various acts that we do when we assemble. That it's also about how you as an individual are approaching God, and it's about your mindset when you come before God. Okay? I know that most of the time when we talk about worship, our minds go to more of the format of how we do it. But it's not all about procedure, it's also about the person. It's not always about procedure. It also has to do with this internal look at ourselves and how we are worshiping God. And so we had talked about how worship is intentional. You know, you will never worship God by accident. You're not going to worship Him by accident. It's intentional. We talked about how worship is a gift. It is an offering. It's something that we are giving to God. It's a gift to Him. Worship is a calling out. It's a reaching out. It's a purposeful intent to get the attention of God. Worship is also a sending something up. And worship is in the giving. It's not necessarily in the getting. Right? And it's all about what we can give to God. And so maybe personally you can think of it like this. You know, what gift am I bringing to God? What offering am I bringing before Him to give to Him, to lay at His feet? Is it the gift of gratitude? Is it the gift of praise? Thanksgiving? What is that? Is it, you know, how am I calling out? How am I reaching out? What am I sending up? These are very personal thoughts that we can think about as we approach Sunday morning, as we approach God and we come before Him. And we talked about how it's in the giving, not the getting. Am I giving something to God, or am I strictly just trying to get from God? Very important things to talk about, which we discussed last time. But, you know, all of this kind of comes under this big umbrella of just being spiritually prepared and examining ourselves when we are coming and drawing near to God. Spiritually prepared. What is our mindset? What is our approach to that? Because those things matter. Our mentality matters in how we come before God. It's not a small thing. It's a big thing. And we should treat it as such. But this lesson is going to be kind of the subsequent lesson to the one that I did a couple of weeks ago. But I have entitled this lesson, Who are the True Worshipers? Who are the true worshipers? I think that's something that a lot of people think about. It's something that people may question. Who is that? Well, I'm sure you're aware, and we just read it, you know, of where that comes from. It comes from John chapter 4. Jesus is having that conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, and when she recognizes that he is a prophet, she totally flips the script, and she wants to talk about worship. And she says in John 4:20 and following, our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. And Jesus responds and He says, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming and where neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. He says, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be His worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. So that's the idea, this true worshiper idea. Who are the true worshipers? All right, I don't know if you've ever asked that question. Who are these worshipers that God seeks that are going to worship Him in the correct way, in spirit and in truth? Is it those who have the sign Church of Christ out in front of the building? Is it those who do not worship with instruments and they only sing a cappella? Are the true worshipers those who partake of the Lord's Lord's Supper every Sunday? Is that who it is, or does it go deeper than that? Is it deeper than just procedure? Perhaps it goes down to the individual. Maybe also it goes down to the heart of a person. But as we talked about last time about some of the components of what worship is, today we'll talk about some of the components of who the true worshipers are. Who the true worshipers are and what they do. All right, so who are the true worshipers? True worshipers, number one, are those that fear the Lord. True worshipers are those that fear the Lord. I know a lot of times that when we come across the word fear in the Bible, people will sometimes say that, well, that simply means respect, or it simply means reverence, and that it means we should treat God with respect. And, in some cases it does, but I want to tell you that the word fear goes a little bit deeper than just having a respect. Yes, we want to have respect or reverence for God, certainly, but oftentimes in the New Testament, when you see the word fear, in the original language it is this word phobos. And maybe you hear the word phobia in that, and you would be correct, because that word literally means fear. It means a terror. It's awe-inspiring. It means to be afraid. And so it's not just a reverence for God, it's also a fear of God. True worshipers will have a legitimate fear of God. We can get a sense of this when we look back to Exodus chapter 20. When Moses came back down from the mountain to give the people the 10 Commandments, it says in Exodus 20, 18 and 19, all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. And then they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But let not God speak to us, or we will die." I don't know if this picture would do it justice, but maybe it looks something like that. Sometimes it helps to have a little bit of a visual behind the things that you read, and maybe that puts your mind there, at least somewhat, but I guarantee you it was way more terrifying than that. But that's the kind of fear of God that we are talking about. Notice what it says in the passage about the people. They trembled. They stood at a distance. They requested that only Moses speak to them and not God. They were convinced that they would die if God spoke to them. In fact, the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 12, verse 19, that when they heard the sound of the words of God, they begged that no further word be spoken to them. They had a fear of God. That is what they felt when they were literally in the presence of God. I tell you that this is a little bit how we ought to feel when we come into the presence of God. Part of our worship in coming before God is having and feeling this sense of fear about us because of who it is we are coming in front of. We're coming into the presence of the almighty, true, and living God. He's the God that demands, yes, our respect and reverence, but also the God that we should fear. Literally. I don't know if people can truly grasp how terrifying it would be to be in the presence of God, but here we see that what these people saw and heard, they were terrified of. In fact, one chapter back in Exodus 19, verse 16, it says, "It came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled." So they were frightened. They shook with fear. They shuddered at what they were seeing and hearing. Again, maybe it was something like that. Kind of describing Exodus 19, verse 16. Maybe it was something like that. But the point is, they feared God. They feared God. Do we have a fear of God? Maybe a better question to ask is, do you have a fear of God? Paul would say, as he is referencing Psalm 36 and verse 1, in Romans chapter 3, verse 18, that he's referencing, the Psalm 36:1 is talking about the wicked, he's talking about the ungodly, but Paul references that in Romans 3:18, and he says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Do you have a fear of God? Paul says that it's the wicked who don't. It's the ungodly who don't. Whether you think so or not, it is good to fear God. It's good to fear God because it helps people stay on the right path. And I want us to notice what it says in verse 20 of Exodus chapter 20. Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of Him may remain with you, so that you may not sin." And that's the whole point. What the presence of God was meant to do was strike a fear in them that would stick with them. The fear of God was something that they were to remember, and it was to remain with them for a reason, so that they would not sin. They were to keep that image of everything that they had seen and heard at the forefront of their minds, because it was supposed to help them not to sin. This is what we would call a healthy fear. A properly placed fear. And you may ask, well, how could having a fear of something be something that's healthy for me? Listen, if it helps you not to sin, it's healthy for you. If it keeps you from separating yourself from God, it's healthy. It's good for you. True worshipers have a healthy fear of God. But I think some of that fear feeling that we should feel gets lost today, actually. I think there are various reasons for that. Maybe it's because we can't necessarily see God. Maybe it's because we don't have swift and immediate punishments to our sin. But I think a big reason as to how some of that gets lost today is because people aren't talking about, nor are they preaching about as much, the fear of the Lord. It's not preached about much anymore. There was a time in the past where a lot of the preaching was on this, hellfire and brimstone. All right, there was a time in the past where it was a lot of that. Men preached about hell. Men preached about the judgment of God and the consequences of sin. And I know that some of those sermons maybe weren't preached in the best of ways, but at their root, they were meant to cause people to think about their life and the way that they were living. They were meant to cause people to stop and think about where they wanted to spend eternity, and that God is a just God. The fear of the Lord was preached. And I believe people back then may have understood the fear of the Lord a little bit more than people do now. But it's good to preach. It's good to preach about, because it helps people stay right with God. It's supposed to help people not sin when it's done in the right way. But church, true worshipers fear the Lord. And when we come into His presence, when we come before Him, there ought to be a healthy fear and an understanding of who He is. In fact, Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear Him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." That's what He says. Fear Him. Jesus says you need to fear God. It'll help you stay straight. How could it be that we could ever worship God in the proper way if we didn't have a fear of Him? The other thing that true worshipers do, true worshipers are those that bow down. I know that might be a little bit of a stretch to get our minds to this bowing down mentality, but when Jesus was in the wilderness being tempted by Satan, Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 through 10, it says, "Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, 'All these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me.' And then Jesus said to him, 'Go, Satan, for it's written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve Him only.'" Quoted from Deuteronomy 6:13 that says, "You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship Him and swear by His name." True worshipers, they fall down and worship God, nobody else. And this falling down, this bowing down, it's actually related to fear, but it's the idea of just humbling yourself in the presence of God. In some ways, I think of it as you're straightening up, so to speak, right? You're acting the way that you're supposed to act. I can remember back when I was playing college football, my freshman year, I was fortunate enough to have this coach, but my freshman year I had a coach that was a very decorated coach, and by that I mean that he had some championships behind his name. Okay, and I was, again, fortunate to be under that for at least a year. But I can remember sitting there in meetings, and when he would walk in, it got quiet. Guys stopped cutting up. There was no more chatter. They stopped doing what they were doing, and all eyes were on him. And, I think about that a little bit. When I think about coming into the presence of God, it's such a humble respect. It's a bowing down. It's putting yourself in this vulnerable state. It's an understanding of who you are in front of. And I think if people can have that kind of mentality for a football coach that walks into the room, who has such a commanding presence, then I think we ought to have that and more for the God that we serve, who does have a commanding presence, one that would push people literally to the ground. Psalm 95:6 comes to mind. "Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." That concept, this kneeling, this bowing down, it puts you in a different mood and mentality when you think of it like that. And you know, the song that we sing, we sing it often really, but Lord, we come before Thee now, at Thy feet we humbly bow. That's the mentality. We sing it. Do we mean it? True worshipers are those that bow down. We come before the Lord and we're totally submissive. We're in that totally vulnerable state before Him. True worshipers are those that understand God's jealousy. Understanding the jealousy of God is also related to fearing the Lord, believe it or not. There are plenty of passages that talk about how God is a jealous God. In fact, Exodus 34:14 is a passage that says that gives one of the names for God, and it is jealous. Deuteronomy 4:24 is another one. The Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. There's plenty of passages. But for true worshipers of God, they understand the jealousy of God and what makes Him jealous. You know, one thing that God hates is when we serve something else other than Him. God hates that. And did you know that the first 3 commandments in the list of the 10 commandments are all about not serving gods or idols? The first 3. Exodus chapter 3, 4, and 20 verses 3, 4, and 5 are all about that. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God. God's very serious about this thing. God is serious about His creation chasing after other things. It makes Him angry when we go after things that are fake, when we go after things that aren't real. He's serious about us running after things that draw us away from Him. He created us. He wants our attention. I think He deserves that. Jesus deserves that. He died for us. He deserves our full attention. But sometimes that's quite a battle for us. And it's quite the challenge, not giving in to the desires of the world and remaining true to God. But true worshipers don't worship the world. True worshipers don't worship the world. True worshipers are in the world, but they're not of the world, and they certainly don't look like the world, and they certainly don't act like the world. They don't bow down to the world or bow down to the things of the world. They bow down to God. He's our king. Nothing else is king. God is king. When we come before God on a Sunday morning, are we coming with one foot in the world and trying to have one foot connected to God, so to speak? Are we got that one foot in the world and we got one hand hanging on to something in the world still? Or are you walking into worship and sitting in the pew, but you've still got a grasp on something outside that is keeping you from fully following Jesus? Let it go. Let go of it. God wants all of you. He doesn't want some of you. Let it go. Commit your life fully. We should never make the Lord jealous by giving our allegiance to anything or anyone other than Him. True worshipers understand that God is a jealous God. There's a lot that goes into what worship is and what it looks like. There's a lot that goes into the format, but there's also a lot that goes into our approach. as Christians and how we should worship God and the attitude we should have. And I believe our mentality matters. It matters how we view God. It matters how we think about God. And it matters how we come before God. But when Jesus says the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, and that God seeks people, such people to be His worshipers, who are those people? Well, they are those that fear the Lord. They are those that bow down to the Lord. And they are those that understand the jealousy of the Lord. True worshipers understand who God is. I think you could sum it up right there. True worshipers understand who God is. And worshiping in spirit has a lot to do with your mindset and your approach. That's what worshiping in spirit is part of. I do hope that, all these thoughts that we've talked about, both in the last lesson and this lesson, I hope that they stick with us. I hope that we remember what kind of worship God asks for and, the approach we should have. I hope that comes to our minds every Lord's Day. Prepare yourself. We're talking about being spiritually prepared. And look, that doesn't necessarily start on Sunday morning. Prepare a few days prior. Prepare tomorrow. How will you come before God on the Lord's Day? Let's live in the fear of the Lord. Let's make sure that we're bowing down to Him, and let's make sure that we live understanding the jealousy of God. Let's be true worshipers that God seeks. Let's be those people. Not just in word, but in practice too. If you have a need this morning or anything, or maybe you're concerned about your relationship with God or how you're viewing God or anything like that, we're here to help. That's what we're here for. But if you do have a need, Richard has our invitation song. You can let it be known. Let's stand and sing.